autumn of 1891, Henri Matisse came to Paris as an aspiring art student in his 22nd year. Born in a small town in the north of France on the last day of the year, 1869, he was a late starter, having previously begun a career in law, which he had studied in Paris in 1887 and 88. He found himself denied official acceptance to the École des Beaux-Arts. Discovered by Gustave Moreau, he was invited to join that painter's atelier in 1892. Over the next decade and more, Matisse would very gradually evolve and discover the new movements in French painting. Throughout his long career, Matisse's art was nourished and replenished by a variety of 19th century movements: neoclassicism, realism, Impressionism, and Post-Impressionism, though not necessarily in that order. As a whole, Matisse's style is inconceivable and inexplicable without this tradition, and yet he developed into one of the most inventive of 20th century masters. Matisse's nominal historical position was a leader of the Fauve. However, Fauvism was a fragile, short-lived movement. If Fauvism had not existed as a movement around 1905, it probably would have made very little difference in the overall development of Matisse's art. The direction followed by Matisse in the years after 1906 is exceptional from many points of view. Unlike his Fauve friends, he seems not to have flirted seriously with the nascent Cubist techniques. He appears to have been determined to solve the problem of modeling a figure simultaneously with the creation of a sturdy, decorative rhythm of line and a powerful contrast of large, flat areas of color and value. His goal was perhaps similar to that of the Cubists, but his means were totally opposite. That Matisse was convinced of his own personal methods at this point saved him from the crisis that overtook many of his contemporaries when they first encountered Cubism. His earliest original paintings tend to be still lifes, and only slowly did he expand, first to landscape and then to major figure paintings. Matisse conducted a private dialogue between himself and his working space, together with its contents, models, other works of art, and those inanimate objects whose sole purpose was to stimulate the creation of the pictorial image. Woman Reading, 1894. Matisse achieved his first public success when this modest, intimate interior was exhibited in 1896 at the Salon du Champ de Mars, organized by the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts. Matisse had little or no knowledge at this time of contemporary trends, and this interior is largely the result of museum study. The theme is furthermore prophetic. The subject of a woman reading recurs in his paintings as late as the 1940s, and the interior itself, almost studio-like with its emphasis upon pictures on the wall, unfortunately not identifiable, as would be the case later, is suggestive of a major preoccupation throughout the artist's oeuvre. Picard's Atelier. The Dessert, 1896. Nude in the Studio, 1898. This bright study in orange and green is one of the artist's first major paintings of the female figure. The technique is suggestive of neo-impressionism, but is here handled with surprising impetuosity. In fact, this picture, which marks Matisse's first liberation from the somber lights of his early manner, certainly owes its technique and luminosity to the landscape studies done in Brittany during his third successive summer trip in 1897. Landscape, The Pink Wall, 1898. Still Life, Orange, 1899. The Invalid, 1899. Painted at the end of Matisse's year-long stay in the South, first in Corsica and then later on in Toulouse, the Invalid is one of his most ambitious and successful interiors of this period. In spite of its small format and sketch-like appearance, its command of a wide range of bright colors, while still somewhat lugubrious, places the picture in the artist's proto-fauve stage. The spatial illusion is thoroughly under control, even though there are patches of bright, advancing colors in the background. A cut-off chair on the left serves as a familiar repoussoir, a compositional device used to expand the illusion of spatial depth. A round table covered with a white cloth dominates the center of the space of the design, becoming through its scale and brightness the focal point of the picture. Self-portrait, 1900. Standing nude, 1900. Interior with harmonium, 1900. Male model, 1900. This monumental picture is one of the finest of the early works and is intimately related to his early explorations in sculpture, the bronze slave being a companion work in that genre. The painted version of the serf seems literally sculpted on the canvas, and the same is almost true of the heavy swatches of blue, green, and other colors that form a far from neutral background. The planes of the body are brutal in their generality, as is the abruptness of their intersections in space. Notre Dame, 1900. Matisse does not seem to have painted the scene from his studio, Quai Saint-Michel, overlooking the Cité, the Parvis of Notre Dame, the quay, bridges, and surrounding buildings. As in most of these views, the bulk of the cathedral does not loom especially large, and the emphasis is on providing a suggestion of the space formed by the historic monument and its surroundings. In different modern edifices, the connecting surfaces of the bridges and the quays, the confined channel of the Seine, and sometimes a passing barge. While the colors are often startling in Matisse's Notre Dame series, the oblique compositional angle, traditional space-forming devices, and atmospheric effect evoke early rather than late Impressionism, in spite of the intense, novel hues. Notre Dame in the Late Afternoon, 1902. Clearly, this is a more adroit composition than the previous picture, with a control of color areas that tells us something of Matisse's power of self-discipline. We are now explicitly told that the picture was painted from an open window, for the shutter and jamb form strong verticals on the right margin. The rather superficial impressionistic agitation of the earlier version is now gone. The barge on the river is absent, and the placement of the figures along the nearer quay more purposeful. The now empty surface of the river is painted with the same imperturbable solidity as the surrounding quays. The Path in the Bois de Boulogne, 1902. This composition is closely related to one of the older artist's favorite motifs, the bend in a road leading to a village. The purple path and the stream at the right are major features that hold everything together. They are overshadowed by the frequently shapeless mass of foliage. The Attic Studio, Studio Under the Eaves, 1903. This unusual, somewhat crudely executed interior was painted in the artist's makeshift studio atop his father's house. In its somber tones, accentuated rather than relieved by the small, luminous landscape glimpsed through the distant window, it, like other pictures of this epoch, looks back beyond the intense, saturated colors of his work in the late 90s. The theme of the open window, heretofore an accessory in his interiors, if it appeared at all, is centralized and exploited for the first time in his work. It was a crucial motif that would occupy the artist until his last paintings. Cyrano, 1903. Carmelina, 1903. The body of the model merges with the draperies, and the roundness of her body works against the familiar rectangular foils of picture frames, a mirror, and drawings pinned to the wall. Tying the whole together is the startling contrast of lights and darks, particularly as they strike the robust, pliant body of the model, making of her figure something more stark and angular than it must have been actually. Contrary to its conservative composition, Carmelina contains the germinal theme of the reflected mirror images of the artist and his model. Lux, calme, and volupte, 1904. The neo-impressionist style is contrived and stiff, and immediately proved uncongenital to Matisse's temperament, even though the palette featured here would continue in his Fauve works. In the foreground, we discover a beach which recedes to the left, leaving an open bay at the right. That margin of the picture is secured by the trunk of a tree, which, through certain spatially ambiguous, almost Cézannesque devices, is linked in surface design with the mast and boom of the beached boat in the middle distance. On this sandy shore, a group of women are caught in a variety of indolent, relaxed attitudes. At lower left, a cloth is spread with the remains of a picnic. Study for Nude in the Atelier, 1905. Lady with a Hat, 1905. Lady with an Umbrella, 1905. The Green Stripe, Madame Matisse, 1905. The green stripe down the nose is theoretically supported by the blue-green of the collar. This axis, with the densely painted flesh tones, support the blue-black crown of hair. These features are kept securely fixed in space through the intense, luminous orange, violet, and green surroundings. Few Fauve canvases are as supported by color alone as this portrait of the artist's wife. Interior in Collioure, 1905. Collioure's Landscape, 1905. Open Window, Collioure. This is the grand classic statement of the open window as a crucial formal and conceptual theme in Matisse's art. With its flanking, framing areas of intense blue-green and electrifying pink, the artist had a format in which he could work out the problem of broad, maximized areas of color. The theme of the landscape seen through the open window, a picture within a picture, carries on in the artist's work. The reflective and translucent panes of glass, vibrantly colored, supplant the more prosaic pictures and frames on the walls of the earlier interiors. The Pastorale, 1905. Study for Life of Joy, 1905. Life of Joy, 1905. Self-Portrait, 1906. Marguerite Reading, 1906. Standing Nude, 1907. In the context of Matisse's evolving figure style in these years, this picture, with its firmly modeled, massive, angular contours and squat proportions, emphasized by a rather oversized head, seems something of an anomaly. Boy with Butterfly's Net, 1907. Le Luxe 1, 1907. This picture, a full-size study for the final version, is undoubtedly more interesting to the critic preoccupied with the evolution of Matisse's art. Le Luxe 1 contains many powerful features that had to be sacrificed in order to reach the expressive heights of the final version. Even the barest survival here and there of a brushstroke suggestive of Impressionism indicates the reluctance with which Matisse was shedding many of the received and learned techniques of his youth. The penumbras surrounding the figures are virtually gone in the sketch, save for the back of the flower girl, and do not appear at all in the final version. And his most brilliant color concept, the pale copper oxide blue-green of the kneeling figure, had to be ruthlessly omitted from the final version for it to attain its unique serenity. Henri Matisse gives us a modern Aphrodite risen from the sea, erotic yet narcissistic, destined only for the eyes. Landscape with Brook, Brook with Aloes, 1907. The surface pattern is here the chief structural device, and color is the vehicle whereby it is accomplished. The brook flows across the front of the scene, but does not lead us back into an illusionistic pace. The hillside of greens, blues, and ochres offers a soft harmony of hues that is barely disturbed by a few impetuously fauve touches of red. Furthermore, the high horizon reinforces the picture's lack of depth, leading the eye upward rather than inward. Harmony in Red, 1908. The magnetic red of the wall and tablecloth, with the interweaving blue pattern, is one of Matisse's most unusual color creations, and its history is fascinating and complex. The canvas began its life as Harmony in Green, and was then transformed into Harmony in Blue. It was publicly exhibited and sold to Shushkin. Then, in 1909, Henri Matisse persuaded Shushkin to return this picture to him, and at that time, the definitive Harmony in Red emerged. The landscape seen through the window at the upper left reinforces the floral arabesques of the interior, setting up a provocative dialogue between nature itself and its decorative transformations found in the interior. Algerian Lady, 1909. The Lady in Green, 1909. Dance, 1910. This painting may be interpreted as an anti-cubist demonstration of how figures may be linked by means of muscular arabesques and intense color contrasts with the abstracted ground, in contrast to Cubism's evolving device of binding together figures and objects through arbitrary overlaps and planar deformations in an illusionistic space. The sources for dance are multiple, reaching back into antiquity. Matisse had been stimulated by observing country dancers at Collioure and Parisian dancing at the Moulin de la Galette, and he kept his eye on contemporary life while developing his modern mythologies. Music, 1910. Matisse turned his attention to a composition of male figures. He reduced them to a series of hieroglyphs, but significantly, musical ones. It remains explicable only in terms of the dancers that preceded and the bathers that were to follow. There is no consistent precedent for identifying dance with the female and music with the male. Indeed, as the pictures presently stand, the sexual differentiation may be virtually meaningless. Marguerite Matisse, 1910. Flower and Ceramics, 1910. Red Studio, 1911. The very simplicity of its hue masks one of the artist's most subtle achievements. The nature of its redness is itself magical, utterly without precedent in other paintings by Matisse. The physical surface is matte and dry. The spatial effect is barely suggested. The local colors of individual objects play almost no role in the total effect, and the final impression is both electric and inductive of contemplation. It's an allegory of the senses, both as a pure painted surface and as a representation of a corner of the artist's studio filled with objects of obvious biographic significance. Pink Studio, The Painter Studio, 1911. The first impression received from this picture is as jolting as that of its companion, Red Studio. The unheralded quality of the pink, which is not as all-pervasive as the red of the other, is in no way muted by the differing intensities applied to the floor and the wall, and the prominent areas of green and blue serve to reinforce its sumptuous luminosity, a quality significantly absent from Red Studio. The topography of the studio is here more explicit. The view, with its glimpse through the open window, is conventionally frontal. Both of these monumental compositions were painted in the same environment. The artist's studio at Issy-les-Moulineaux is demonstrated by the correspondence of several works of art, notably the second version of Le Luxe, indicating that the right third of Red Studio is, in actuality, the left third of Pink Studio. The Painter's Family, 1911. Henri Matisse's wife is in the left distance. His sons, Pierre and Jean, are at the checkerboard, and his daughter, Marguerite, stands at the right. While not muted, the color is static, a feature helped by Marguerite's black dress. A single work of art, a small bronze figure, stands on the mantel over the central fireplace. Otherwise, this is a domestic, bourgeois interior, and despite the picture's large size, remarkably intimist in quality. Still Life with Aubergine, 1911. 3 aubergines, or eggplants, are balanced precariously on a tablecloth, carrying an undulating white pattern that reinforces their tuberous shape. A mirror at the left, partly obscured at the bottom by a drawing portfolio, reflects these and other objects on the table in an inconsistent fashion. Behind the screen, we glimpse the top of an open door, probably leading to another room, where our eye is arrested by a checkered blue hanging. On the wall to the right is an open window with a real landscape beyond. For the rest, the floor and wall are covered with abstract 5-part floral patterns, all identical. The total effect of the picture is one of an imaginary landscape constructed of a studio interior, since the space is as rich in floral abundances as it is in conventional studio props. Moroccan Landscape, 1912. Moroccan Garden, Pervenche, 1912. Henri Matisse, in his experience of North Africa, has quickly integrated his perceptions of a new and unfamiliar environment with his habitual matured manner of structuring a landscape. The rose of the sky is joined to the greens of the foreground through the color and structure of the tree trunk, and the foliage is rendered in large patches held together in the distance by billowing arabesques. These in turn contrast with the few specific individual leaves that are summarily indicated in the foreground. The route that was traversed can be seen not only in landscape paintings per se, but in the many glimpses of exteriors seen through open windows. Zora, the Yellow Dress, 1912. Zora on the Terrace, 1912. With this crouching study of the Tangier model, Zora, Matisse creates the centerpiece of a new tripartite composition. The artist places his model outside, on a rooftop under blazing sunlight, with a minimum of accessories. But the intensity of the light is muted by a pale green shadow that supports this color in Zora's dress, much as the blue of the carpet functions for the lower part of her dress. The clear patch of sunlight in the upper left is balanced by a matching hue in the goldfish bowl in the lower right. As for the goldfish bowl, an element curiously out of context here, it is simply a reference to a motif that the artist was currently exploring in many different versions in his studio. In effect, given its placement, we might think of the goldfish as Matisse's monogrammed signature to this picture. Entrance to the Casbah, 1912. This painting is the right wing of the triptych that the artist produced during his second trip to Tangier. Although there is a sketchily realized seated figure in the shadow at the left, this picture is almost exclusively concerned with rendering a tightly defined architectural space as seen under the violent contrasts of light and shade typical in North Africa. The blue circle of sky is barely distinguishable from the blue of the arched passage. The blue shadows of the foreground are only slightly more saturated, perhaps chiefly to support the intense pitch of the pink stream of sunlight on the pavement. In the picture, we are offered a broad panorama of the city, perhaps from the artist's hotel room, whereas here the view beyond is constricted with respect to both width and depth. Madame Matisse, 1913. The mask-like face is modeled in gray, and the features are picked out by a series of curved lines that structurally relate to the general shape of the head. The blue-suited body is flattened, its contours closely related to the green outline of the wicker chair. The play of blue and green, the former dominating, is accented by an orange stole, which likewise relates on the left side to the vertical of the chair and body arm, but on the right cuts across it. Its function is largely to prevent the disappearance of the figure in the relatively uniform blue background, which gives no hint as to specific environment. Madame Landsberg's portrait, 1914. White and pink head, 1914. Composition, The Yellow Curtain, 1914. The picture presents a daringly abstract landscape and frame, which are contrasted with the relatively realistic handling of the curtain at the left. The green areas of the architectural border are so flatly treated that the landscape beyond is almost literally a picture within a picture, and might even be read as a boldly simplified painting hanging on a studio wall. The curtain is actually red with a green floral pattern, and its reverse side, yellow, is seen in only two places, where it's fluttered back into the room as the result of a breeze. Its yellow is nearly identical to the yellow ochre ground of the landscape, a broad, flatly painted area which vibrates against two areas of relatively pale hue, the sky at the top and the elliptical form at the bottom, an area that might also be read as the pool of a small garden. Interior, Fishbowl, 1914. Goldfish, 1915. The fish in their round aquarium are placed on a table in front of a window in a curious, decoratively cubistic manner. The space through the open window has been arbitrarily altered, interrupted by an inexplicable dislocation of what might be wall panels or window shutters, which are moved to the center, forming a dark vertical register. In this quasi- or neo-cubist picture of a view through an open window, Matisse has managed to indicate three separate environments, namely, reading from back to front, the sky of the exterior, the water of the aquarium, and the space of the interior. The Green Dress, 1916. Greta Prozor's portrait, 1916. Tree, nearby Trivaux, 1916. Bathers by the River, 1916. This painting remained in the artist's studio for 7 years before being completed in his neo-cubist manner. He did not completely paint the figures that he had commenced in 1910. What seems clear from the surviving passages is that the figures were originally smaller, and that in the final painting they were enlarged so that they equal the entire height of the picture. Indeed, the figure at the right is so elongated that her feet are cut off by the bottom of the frame. The Moroccans, 1916. The architecture of the upper left evokes entrance to the Kasbah, and the display of melons and their leaves is suggestive of the limpid, lyrical design of Moroccan garden. These elements are situated one above the other on the left side. On the right, we find a group of Moroccans at prayer, and this is the most challenging, hard-to-read part of the composition. However, their gestures of supplication are somehow clarified by the design of the several melons in the lower left. This area has often mistakenly been identified as a group of figures touching their foreheads to the ground. The final unifying device is the repetition of the circular motif throughout the three elements, so that the domes of the architecture, the blue flowers in the pot, the spherical melons, and the rounded bodies of the worshippers all share the same motif. The Studio, near Saint-Michel, 1916. The Piano Lesson, 1916. With its large areas of smoothly brushed gray, green, and pink, and its severely simple design, this painting would seem to be the most abstract of Matisse's monumental canvases. In subject as well as in execution, the Piano Lesson is related to the four symphonic interiors, the theme of the studio and the painter's living room now being integrated. But the balance of mixing is variable. Here the emphasis is on art. Note the inclusion of the bronze figure at the lower left, and an objective and spatial geometry. The diagonal ray of sunlight, unrealistically rendered in green and suggestive of his effects in Sunlight in the Forest, echoes the pyramidal shape of the metronome in the right foreground. Road in Clamart, 1917. Sunlight in the Forest, 1917. This perplexing picture has previously been known as Path in the Forest or Road in the Forest, and conjecturally dated even as early as 1912. No detailed explanation of the parts of this picture can be completely satisfactory. It's not clear which parts of the picture are to be read in as sunlight and which are to be taken as in shadow. The path itself is the long, central, pale-hued element, but whether the massive dark diagonal that brutally intersects it should be seen paradoxically as the ray of sunlight filtering through the trees, or whether it is an incidental path of intense shadow. It is the most abstract of Matisse's landscapes, in part a neo-cubist study. The Painter and His Model, 1917. This work was painted in Matisse's old studio on the Quai Saint-Michel. The picture offers diagonal views through the window at the right, showing fragments of the Pont Saint-Michel and the buildings beyond. The starkness of the figure and the setting are in contrast to the luxuriance that is spelled out later in decorative figure, thus providing an incidental, anecdotal contact between this severe composition and the decorative profuseness of Matisse's subsequent work in the 20s. The pose of the artist is exceptionally rigid, in contrast to the more comfortable position of the model. His body and palette are painted in a pale brown orange. The heart-shaped iron grille of the window corresponds to the curves of the Moorish frame and relieves the picture's starkness. Coming in the wake of the 1917 The Painter and His Model, this gentle study would seem to indicate a slackening of intensity, a détente in which the artist gives himself over the hedonistic self-indulgence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The politics of the avant-garde, especially of the Dadaists, Surrealists, and Abstractionists of the 1920s, and later, dictated that Matisse would be one of these painters castigated for having capitulated to a public willing to accept tame, modernistic paintings, and for working this market rather than plunging ahead into more obvious frontiers of visual and metaphysical speculation. But this essentially political criticism takes no account of Matisse's own private growth over the previous 2 decades. Hence, this negative view is fundamentally irrelevant to Matisse's work and the necessity for a modification of his style at this crucial juncture. In terms of inner coherence of his evolving career, Matisse pushed relentlessly onward all through the 20s. The Artist and His Model, 1919. The design of this picture is complex, yet sturdily ordered, and the nuances of color and tone demanded a supple, almost creamy texture to the paint, in opposition to the flat, sometimes indifferently brushed-in areas in some immediately preceding masterpieces. The seductive outlining of the model should be compared with that of Carmelina, and indicates a new and more intimate feeling for the natural, spontaneous poses of the female form. Algerian Woman, 1919. Odalisque with the Red Trousers, 1921. Young Ladies and Mauresque Interior, 1921. Lady and the Red Fish, 1921. Interior at Nice, 1921. To judge from the color and the grid of the carpet, this picture was painted in the same hotel in Nice as was The Artist and His Model. The format and vantage point have been changed, but the soft interior tone and light seem virtually the same. The abrupt, disconcerting changes that we can see between Red Studio and Pink Studio a decade previously, both having been painted in the same interior, are here absent, and the temptation is to think that Matisse has allowed his imagination to slacken somewhat. In fact, he has simply become more subtle in the varying ways in which he converts a familiar space into a unique pictorial event. The window, now open, returns us to the dichotomy between inner and outer space. The model, now clothed, is outside on the terrace, beyond the immediate world of the artist, and hence the picture lacks the close-in, intimate quality of the artist and his model. Furthermore, from the variations in furnishings and of the paintings on the wall adjacent to the window, we perceive a passage of time, a phenomenon significantly lacking in the earlier related studio pictures. Nice Interior, The Nap, 1922. Odalisque with Arms Up, 1923. Madame Gourgaud's Portrait, 1924. Still Life with Apples on Pink Cloth, 1925. This radiantly beautiful study of yellow apples set against a pink cloth which reverberates with the blue of the background hanging is an exceptionally fine instance of the artist mid-career, halfway between his beginnings and his culmination. Like many of the odalisques of this decade, this is a pivotal work both in style and subject. Like the figure and interior studies, this painting shows the artist seeking an intimacy of scale and a compensatory reduction in overpowering architectonic design. Interior with Phonograph, Interior with Mirror, 1924. Sometimes titled Still Life with Raised Curtain, certainly a more complete and focused description of the subject, this muted, sunlit interior provides a striking contrast to the monumental studio paintings of 1911. The studio is empty of people, the model dismissed. Only the artist is present, in a slight mirror image in the distance, visible just at the point where the curtain, employed to different effect in Moorish screen, has been gathered up. There, the fully spread curtain served as a foil for the two conversing models. Here, it is employed with an intent of providing a picture within a picture. The light sources are complex. Not only is there the light from the implied window at the left, whose panes cast their grid of shadows on the opposite wall at the right, but also the light from the window of the room in the distance, through which is framed still another view. The still life in the foreground, consisting of a pineapple, some oranges and lemons, a flowered china bottle, and a vase of flowers, is set off by a red and white striped cloth. The play of the yellow lemons against the bronze tray and the pale yellow-orange hues of the pineapple is indicative of the artist's refined sensibility in search of ever-different adventures in color. Notable also is the way in which the vase is here outlined in white, whereas in paintings of a more intense palette, black was sometimes used to support the structure of objects. Sitting Nude in Red, 1925. Decorative Figure, 1925. This is traditionally considered the culmination of Matisse's preoccupation with the female nude in an Oriental setting. The background is a remarkable series of variations on a decorative theme, with a nominally repetitive motif that, as painted, never repeats itself exactly in the same way. Although the figure sits in stark contrast to the ever-varying curves of this backdrop, which contains, nearly lost within its density, the Moorish mirror seen earlier in the painter and his model, the drapery twined from behind her back across her thigh serves as crucial link. The model sits within a grayish zone on the floor, which serves to separate the patterns of the carpet from those of the wall hanging. In addition, there are a potted plant, a bowl of fruit, and in the lower right, the suggestion of the corner of a veined marble-topped table. Yet, in spite of this profusion of objects and motifs, the composition never seems cluttered. Everything falls into place, even the abrupt, unnaturally straight line of the model's back. Yellow Odalisque, 1926. The sumptuously modeled, opulently colored reclining nudes, together with the odalisques in Moorish costume, represent as a group the artist's most revealing theme in the 1920s. For the most part, it is clear that these women are occupants of the artist's own studio space, and in effect, their presence serves to eroticize the objects from his own collections, screens, hangings, and so forth. The Red Odalisque, 1928. It is notable that he did not pay much attention to this master's art until some 2 decades after his discovery of Cézanne, even though he may have seen Renoir's work at Vollars around 1900. Hence, Matisse was maturely equipped not to borrow from or submit to the influence of Renoir, but rather to clarify and intensify his late classical romantic study of the female form. In his nudes and odalisques of the early 1920s, Matisse had already explored Renoir's way of treating a classical theme. Now he turned, logically and methodically, to a rephrasing in his own manner of elements drawn from Ingres's even purer neoclassicism. By turning in Ingres's direction at the end of the 20s, he was echoing a tendency that had emerged a decade earlier in the work of his greatest rival, Picasso. At the same time, this new influence in Matisse's art was completely consistent with his own inner development, and would shortly be revealed in the murals and the book designs of the early 30s. Woman with a Veil, Portrait of Mademoiselle H.D., 1927. The rich, sonorous color of this intense study is an extreme statement of the artist's palette at the time. The woman's body seems enveloped in an enormous stole of a diagonal checkered pattern. The local colors, save for the flesh tones and the gray diaphanous sleeves, seem to be largely of the artist's invention. The red, green, and yellow are close to the hues Matisse normally employed as a fauve, but the atmosphere of the picture is transformed into something more luxuriant by the violets and pale blues of the background. The pose of the head, balanced on the model's hand, and the insistent relation of the body to the contour of the chair are suggestive of Ingres. Still Life and Green Cabinet, 1928. Young Lady in a Yellow Dress, 1930. Study for Dance 1, 1930. Composed as a mural to fit an architecturally confining space in Dr. Barnes's main picture gallery, the Commission provided Matisse with a new, yet not wholly unfamiliar, functional problem. Dance and music of 1910 had definite architectural ambitions, since they were painted for specific locations in Shushkin's house. Moreover, the fact that Matisse was given erroneous dimensions for the lunette-like space they were occupying offered the artist a second challenge to restudy the dance motif, since the mistake was not discovered until one full-size version had already been completed. He did not simply adapt his first composition to the new dimensions, but instead re-explored the whole theme. In the present preliminary studies, we glimpse the remains of the earlier concept of a ring of dancers, their hands held in powerful linking tension. Gradually, the artist took this architectural feature into account, until in these present studies, the tense circle is broken, some of the dancers having fallen to the ground in exhaustion, while others remain erect, triumphant survivors of the Bacchic frenzy. Dance 1, 1932. The Dream, 1935. Pink Nude, 1935. Window in Tahiti, 1935. During his visit to the South Seas, specifically Tahiti, Matisse did several remarkable drawings, but no paintings. Hence, it was not until 5 years after the trip that the artist sought to condense his experiences, relying in part on studies realized on the spot, producing this tapestry cartoon, which functions as a monumental souvenir of his voyage. Carrying over from his earlier picture is only the ship, moored with its sails furled. As we look through the open window across the placid, tranquil scene, the somber colors suggest a new and different sort of light in his work. Only the balustrade at the bottom suggests an architectural reference to the window, for the point of view from which the artist is recording his sensations. The human figure has been banished. The foliage and clouds and the indications of a curtain on the left are of a curving pattern whose scale and weight is remarkably uniform throughout. Elena in a striped dress, 1937. Striped dress, 1937. The Lady with the Caraco Red, 1937. The Lady in Blue, 1937. Two Dancers, 1938. The Reader, 1939. Music, 1939. Two familiar motifs inherent in the art of Matisse are now distilled with marvelous restraint in another late masterpiece. That of the calming influence of music is here placed in the context of its repeated motif of the 1920s, a pair of female figures in either complementary or parallel attitudes. The female twosome was, in fact, the motif for some of his most splendid drawings of the Nice period. Later, this theme will be transformed once again in the 1947 series of Women Reading, but in the present picture, the two women receive their most monumental, hierarchic treatment. Romanian Blouse, 1940. Still Life with Oysters, 1940. Pineapples and Anemones, 1940. The Dream, 1940. Interior with an Etruscan Vase, 1940. Still Life with Green Marble, 1941. Two Young Ladies, The Yellow Dress, 1941. Still Life with Magnolia, 1941. Narcissus and Fruits, 1941. Sitting Dancer, Rocks, 1942. The Black Door, 1942. The Idol, 1942. The Clown, 1943. The Circus, 1943. Monsieur Loyal, 1943. The Nightmare of the White Elephant, 1943. Icarus, 1943. The Burial of Pierrot, 1943. The Sword Swallower, 1943. The Knife Juggler, 1943. The Destiny, 1943. The Slide, 1943. Michaelia, 1943. The Luth, 1943. The Horse, the Rider, and the Clown, 1944. The Heart, 1944. The Wolf, 1944. Forms, 1944. The Kodamas, 1944. The Swimmer in the Aquarium, 1944. The Lagoon, 17th, 1944. The Lagoon, 18th, 1944. The Lagoon, 19th, 1943. Young Lady in White, 1944. Interior Yellow and Blue, 1946. Polynesia, the Sky, 1946. Polynesia, the Sea, 1946. Young Lady in White, Red Background, 1946. Madame L.D., 1947. Young English Lady, 1947. Little Blue Interior, 1947. The Prune Tree's Branch, 1948. The Pineapple, 1948. Interior with Egyptian Curtain, 1948. Big Red Interior, 1948. Dominican Chapel of the Rosary, Vence, 1948. There is a temptation to see in this unique effort an exceptional isolated incident in the artist's late career, an act of devotion on the part of an atheist, an ex voto celebrating his recovery from the two serious surgical operations of 1941. Matisse at Vence had his one opportunity to create a total environment, drawing together most of the mediums in which he had already worked. No paintings are present, the role of the color being assumed by the stained glass windows, which establish the interior tonality in such a way that the visitor, if alone, has the sensation of literally walking into one of the artist's paintings, especially one of the large studio interiors. The mural decorations, notably the Stations of the Cross, are in glazed ceramic tile. He also modeled the altar crucifix and, in addition, designed the vestments for the priests. It is the blue and yellow of the windows and the magical nature of the light which they admit to the simple, functional interior that dominate the entire ensemble, ensuring its unity and establishing the chapel as a unique contribution to the history of contemporary architecture. Zulma, 1950. The Caribbean Dancer, 1950. Blue Nude, 1952. Blue Nude 3, 1952. Face on a Yellow Background, 1952. Acrobat, 1952. Nude with Oranges, 1953. The Snail, 1953. This composition of squarish and rectangular patches that organize themselves into a snail-like spiral pattern has no precedent in Matisse's career. The tension between the angularity of the forms themselves and the imaginary receding curve which forms their unifying axis has a notable, totally unexpected effect. Since this square painting, conspicuously featuring squarish forms, is titled The Snail, it is fair to assume that the imaginary circular motif was of considerable importance in the virtually archetypal geometric forms here displayed. The Sorrows of the King, 1952. This picture is in effect the last great, essentially pictorial effort of the artist, a thorough, valedictory summation and interweaving of many themes developed and repeated over the years. It is also a leave-taking, in which the artist, here seen as the king, shrouded in black, himself holding the guitar rather than the brushes, bids farewell to his studio, to his female models, and to the themes of music and dance. With a vivid and masterful blending and contrasting of blues, greens, magentas, and yellows, Matisse brings together many compelling, even competing elements in his art. The universality of this picture's eloquence is virtually unparalleled, even in the greatest moments of his career of more than 60 years. In The Sorrows and the King, we have a symbolic collage, with the artist as self-recognized painter laureate. Color and design were Matisse's primary materials, and here they reach their ultimate apotheosis. It is a self-portrait of himself and of his art. Henri Matisse died November 3rd, 1954.